But let's talk now to Alain Tolhurst, chief reporter at Politics Home. There's a couple of big stories this morning to get our teeth into, all of which probably will surround the Donald Trump issue. Donald Trump finally made a phone call to Downing Street yesterday. Alan, very good morning to you.
Morning, Mike.
So, interesting, isn't it? Because all the people who said, it doesn't matter about Donald Trump, it doesn't really matter if he gets invited to the inauguration, doesn't matter if he doesn't talk to him first. They're all kind of going, he made the call, he made the call, he did, he's now made the call, everything's fine. But it isn't really, is it? It's not, nothing's really changed.
No, and I think what's quite interesting is that from the readout, which is, we'll kind of get onto kind of the difference between like a readout, the kind of bland, banal summary, and actually what probably happened on the call. But it's clear from the reporting that they didn't touch kind of some of those key dividing lines, so things like tariffs, the deal with the Chagos Islands, that sort of stuff. And so clearly there is still going to be, this was the kind of the call to kind of just to make nice, to touch base, as they say, but actually it doesn't really cover some of those big kind of issues that clearly are going to come between the UK and the new American administration.
Well, that's why I wonder whether when the Downing Street said it was a 45-minute call, I'm not sure that it actually was. I mean, I don't really care how long the call was for, but from what I read last night, as you say, the readout, Prime Minister paid tribute to President Trump's role in securing the landmark ceasefire and hostage deal in Gaza. President welcomed the release of Emily Damarai and sent his best wishes to the family. They discussed the importance of working together for security in the Middle East. They also discussed trade and the economy. Prime Minister setting out how we are deregulating to boost growth. Blah, blah, blah. I mean, it doesn't sound like a 45-minute call to me. I mean, I'm 45-minute calls with my sister. We get into a lot more than that. I'll tell you what, we've even covered the Oscars.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I'd love to know who writes these readouts, because there's a real skill to them to as you say, to take a 45-minute call, if it was that, and turn it into this kind of 3 paragraphs that really don't say a great deal.
No.
And I think I remember speaking to people who worked for Theresa May and her administration, and the calls that she would have with Donald Trump in his first time as president, and they would go on wild flights of fancy. Donald Trump would talk about all sorts. Theresa May would always be trying to drag him back to the talking points and never could. And actually the truth of those calls was often much more interesting and much wilder than those very banal readouts. So I think we'll probably get some more reporting. I imagine there'll be a bit more reporting on this call today, and we'll find out actually what made up those full 45 minutes and what exactly Donald Trump decided to kind of go after Keir Starmer about, because obviously he talked about him in quite glowing terms on Air Force One, speaking to reporters yesterday, but we know that from people around him that he has a pretty dim view of a lot of things that Keir Starmer has been pursuing. Right. So it'd be interesting to see if he did kind of take him to task a bit more than the official readout from the UK side necessarily puts forward.
Right. Well, I mean, he's also got Elon Musk in his administration. He's been calling for Keir Starmer to be locked up. In addition to being, taken out of Downing Street and replaced by somebody else. So, I don't think there's any doubt. I mean, in the old days, you would sort of check what the Americans were saying about this phone call. But, of course, they probably haven't issued anything in America about his phone call to Keir Starmer, because nobody in America knows who Keir Starmer is and cares even less.
Right, well, I'll definitely keep an eye out. But yeah, I think it's kind of interesting. And like I said, he spoke to reporters on Air Force when he talked about where his first trip was going to be. Yeah. Obviously, it's usually, he talks about historically it's to the UK, but he's talking about it's going to be to Saudi Arabia because they gave him loads of money last time, and he wants them to give the US more money this time round. But it is clear that he understands that the nature of that relationship, whether he actually is as close to Keir Starmer as would be a different kind of leader. But I think clearly he does feel, though, he understands his kind of commitment, the US's commitment to the UK, and so we could see that kind of state visit happening next year, and it'd be interesting to see how all sides kind of play that, essentially, that state visit, given, as you say, the kind of negative things that said.
Yeah, I'm assuming state visits take a bit of time to set up, don't they? I mean, and if it hadn't really been set up before the inauguration, it's not likely to be happening here, and certainly not before the autumn, you wouldn't think, whereas somewhere like Saudi Arabia, where things can be done a lot quicker. He had a conversation with Mohammed bin Salman last week in which he was promised $600 billion from the Saudi wealth fund. I think he's probably more than likely to pop in there. And this might come from left field for me, but check this out, right? Piers Morgan is currently in Saudi Arabia, and it would not surprise me if he's there, because it might be that he's got more chance of seeing Donald Trump in Saudi than he has in America.
Well, yeah, there is a good chance of that. I suppose he has had a few kind of those Air Force One interviews over the years, hasn't he, where he's been able to follow where he's going. If you remember last time, actually, Theresa May, they arranged that state visit for Donald Trump to come to the UK, but actually she managed to nip out to Washington and be the first person to go to visit, the first foreign leader to go and visit Donald Trump in his White House. Obviously, that hasn't happened this time round. I don't know too much to read into that, but clearly, I think it would have been, if you wanted to speak to him, if you wanted to get FaceTime, I think with Donald Trump, it would have been easier, I think, for the UK leader to go over there rather than wait for him to come over here, because you say all the kind of pomp and circumstance, you've got to polish the gold, polish the gold carriages and all that kind of stuff for him to be pottering around Windsor. And
he loves all that. He doesn't want to come here unless he's going to get that. I mean,
absolutely.
I mean, they managed to squeeze in that he sent his best wishes to the royal family. You know, he's a great big fan of the royals. And
he was waxing lyrical about Prince William, wasn't he, a few weeks ago, all that kind of stuff. So I think if there is a way to kind of to win over Donald Trump, I think it is, you know, using kind of the sort of soft power of the royal family and kind of flattery and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, but the other side, of course, of the Downing Street machine is the story that came out in the Times this morning, which presumably is in my view anyway, Labour kind of giving a sop to their left wing, if you like, where basically Starmer saying he's going to defy Trump over cash for defence. He says he's not going to be answering the call to increase defence spending to 2.5% of GDP because apparently we haven't got the money, which is kind of rich coming from Starmer, given that they found money for all manner of other things. But I don't know whether he's seen what happened in Colombia with the Colombian president. He might want to revisit whether he wants to defy Trump, because he might find himself on the wrong end of a load of tariffs.
Yeah, it's interesting because basically, as soon as the Labour won last year, they enacted a whole series of reviews. One of which was a massive review of defence spending and the whole kind of defence industry in the UK, and that's due to report not until later this spring. And so obviously that is going to, when that comes back, John Healey, the Defence Secretary, said that he'll then talk about how the UK is to set out plans to increase defence spending, and they have committed to going up to 2.5%, not to 3% as some would have liked, but to 2.5%. But clearly they're already signalling that that's not going to happen before 2030. So basically not while the time that Donald Trump is in office, because they say that it would mean harder cuts to public services elsewhere. And I think they'll be probably use the fact that other big NATO countries have not been able to increase their defence spending, and obviously Donald Trump's been very critical of them. So obviously it puts the UK on the kind of the wrong side of Donald Trump, but obviously there are other countries that have failed to do so as well. And I think that's definitely something that will definitely come to a head, because Donald Trump was really critical last time round of countries thinking that they weren't paying their way, and certainly this time round with the amount of money that the US is spending on Ukraine and in Israel and elsewhere, they'll definitely want to see other countries kind of pulling their weight more around defence spending. So I think that could be a definite kind of tricky conversation with Donald Trump as they go down the track.
Absolutely. Let's have a look at Rachel Reeves. She was out and about on Sunday talking about a great many things on the BBC, on Sky as well. She's also said that she wants to see a bit of sort of Trump-style positivity, which came out in a speech she made, or an interview she gave just over the weekend as well. But here she was, I wouldn't say exactly setting out her stall with Trevor Phillips on Sky about getting back in with the European Union.
Well, it was really interesting to see Maroš Šefčovič this week suggest that Britain might be welcome.
The EU Trade Commissioner.
Yeah, the UK might be welcome in that pan-European and Mediterranean customs framework.
Yeah, I'm not sure whether she wants to join up with the European Union or with the positivity of Trump. It's not all that clear, is it?
No, and that's definitely be an issue for not just this administration, but previous UKs are kind of in between, America and those big trading blocs with America and the European Union. I think there was some polling in the Observer suggesting that the public want us to be closer to the EU than they want us to be Trump's administration. And obviously, as you say, Maroš Šefčovič, the EU Trade Commissioner, kind of cheekily talked that, saying that the UK should kind of join this PEM, which is not the kind of the customs union, the thing that we left when we left the European Union, but a slightly different kind of trading arrangement. Whether that would anger the US or how it kind of be, but it's an interesting kind of moment. And clearly the UK, as you say, she talked about kind of a bit more kind of boosterism, and that's the problem, is that if you've been very negative about the economic situation for so long, people start to believe it, and we've seen kind of business confidence fall back. Obviously the economy is not growing the way they would like, and so they're searching around for ways to kind of get things going again. And so, yeah, talking about that kind of positivity. But as you say, she wasn't particularly positive about that. About that
No.
kind of about
And
that
also,
move.
she
And I
hasn't
think
really
clearly
been. I
they
mean,
knew
she's
about
been positive latterly about the economy, talking
Yeah.
about how it's going to recover and what she's doing to stop it from, shrinking. But in fact, if you remember, when she got in first, it was all about how terrible it was, how awful things were going to be, how much worse it was going to get, and the inheritance was terrible. And
the 22 billion pound black hole, all that kind of stuff.
22 billion pound black hole. But they can't really say that continually, especially since in December they borrowed 17.8 billion from the Treasury. So they've more or less doubled the 22 billion pound black hole in 1 month.
Yeah, I mean, they would say obviously, but then they would raise a huge amount of tax in terms of the national insurance and all that kind of stuff to try and cover a lot of that off. But yeah, you're right. I think the previous Conservative administration was quite good at sort of saying, we were left no money, Labour crashed the economy, etc., in the financial crisis. But you can't use that forever. Essentially, people want to see what you're doing, and I think there was some polling in the Mail on Sunday. It was quite damning of kind of Starmer's leadership.
Yeah, I was just going to get onto that.
Yeah, but kind of the positivity about kind of how they feel about how the economy is going, and that is kind of a big issue as well. And I think that often governments of all stripes fall back on this kind of crutch of like making international comparisons or year-on-year comparisons about how things are going. People don't really care about that. People know how they feel and how well they actually feel themselves. And if they don't feel positive about how the way things are going and they feel better or worse off, rather than better off, then that's a very bad place to find yourself.
Yeah, absolutely right. And I mean, basically, some of the findings from a Lord Ashcroft poll, basically, how have the government's decisions affected you? Positively, 5%, negatively, 43%. Then a view on Labour, doing good things, 10%, haven't achieved very much, 41%, want them out as soon as possible, 38%. These are pretty damning numbers. And basically, is Britain on the right track? No, 57%. Is the British economy doing well? No, 82%. It's not looking good for Starmer, and his approval ratings dipped even further than it was last week.
Yeah, and I would normally caution politicians to ignore polling when you're so far away from an election. But the problem is that it tends to affect the way that politicians think when they know that things, and then you kind of chase those numbers. What you should be doing, obviously, is kind of ignoring a lot of that kind of that's noise that's in the background and pursuing the things that you think are the right thing, and hoping that eventually people will come round to it. They'll start to see the effects. The problem is that if you see those kind of numbers and you might have backbenchers coming forward and say, look, we're doing really badly in the polls, we need to switch gears, we need to change tack. And when you start to kind of reverse the things that you're doing, then people don't really like that either, because they think that you're not kind of sticking to your guns. So it's a very difficult place to be. Essentially, you've got to try and block this stuff out and kind of ignore it as much as you can, difficult as it may be, and kind of crack on if you believe in what you're actually trying to achieve as in government.
Yeah, the problem is they've got so many issues which are a problem for them, and let's just finally end up with Kemi Badenoch, who was also on the morning shows yesterday, talking about why the UK, in her view, needs a dominant culture.
One of the things that I don't think we have been doing in this country properly is having a proper immigration strategy. And many people assume that it's just something that government does. It has to go well beyond government. All of society has to do it. And that's what used to happen when we had immigration in much smaller, much more manageable numbers. And the numbers that we have seen over the last few decades mean that we are getting people having separate and insular communities. The most extreme example of this is what we saw with the rape gangs, where people who've been coming to this country from the 60s, from a particular region and sub-community in Pakistan, get here, stay insular, not interested in integration, and then you start seeing very, very toxic, I would say evil habits propagating, and no one doing anything about it because they're separate. We have to make sure that we have a dominant culture in our country, and the people who move here want to help make the UK a better place. Our country is not a hotel, it's not a dormitory, this is our home.
And that's another problem for Keir Starmer, because he can't really have those conversations. He doesn't like having those conversations. His party doesn't like having them. But the country wants them.
Yeah, it's interesting though. I mean, the phrase "dominant culture" I think is quite I don't know. It's a bit of a tricky one, I think, to try and pass out. And I think Kemi Badenoch was quite good at assessing kind of the problems there. And I think most people would say that actually there has been a failure of integration in certain communities, and that's sort of something that people want to improve on. She didn't really talk about kind of the way that you would go about that. She didn't really talk about. She talked about changing immigration policy, but she doesn't have any policies. She didn't talk about how actually she would solve that. So I think if she's going to keep diagnosing these these potential problems with the UK. I think for people to take her seriously, she kind of has to come up with some solutions. And I think you're right. While it's a tricky position for Labour to find themselves in, and they've not been able to put forward policies that are having a material impact on immigration and those kind of other stuff, I think Kate Badenoch is in a tricky place as well, because unless she actually sets out how to solve that, she's going to seem like
but she's playing Labour at their own game, isn't she? Because that's, of course, what Labour used to do. Labour used to say you've got to fix this, but then they wouldn't say how. When they got elected, they found out that actually they couldn't fix it either. So you know, it swings and roundabouts. But listen, Alan, we've got to run. Thank you very much indeed, Alain Tolhurst, there, Chief Reporter at Politics Home.